And when one gambler trusted another enough to share sake from the same cup, it meant they were bound as Oyabin and Koban family until death, or until someone cheated at dice. A gentle slide toward respectability as decades passed. The line between criminal and citizen blurred. Takia ran legitimate businesses between scams. Bakuto sometimes funded village repairs with their winnings. Some even hired unemployed samurai as enforcers, because nothing says responsible management like giving a man with a sword a reason not to use it. The Tokugawa government tolerated this delicate balance. Too much repression risked unrest. Too much freedom risked chaos. So the Yakuza's ancestors existed in a gray zone, useful enough to ignore, unsavory enough to fear. Honor among outlaws, both Takia and Bakuto, followed unwritten codes precursors to the Yakuza's later ethics of ninkyo, or chivalry. A gambler didn't cheat his own group. A peddler didn't rob his own customers. And everyone respected the chain of command. If you broke those rules, punishment was swift but precise. The most famous was Yubitsumda, ritual of finger shortening. A man who failed his oyaban would kneel, apologize, and slice off part of his little finger. He'd present it wrapped neatly in paper, because politeness doesn't end at dismemberment. Each joint lost weakened his grip on a sword or nifa, poetic reminder of his dependence on the boss for protection. It was discipline, humility, and occupational hazard all in one gesture. The Edo Knight imagined the scene, a smoky gambling den on the edge of a rice. Field lanterns sway, dice click softly in bamboo. The men sit cross-legged, faces impassive, sleeves rolled back to reveal the edges of blue-black ink. Outside, the air smells of rain and river mud. Somewhere, a shamisen plays slow, slightly out of tune. This was the cradle of the Yakuza world. Not violence, not drugs, just risk, reputation, and ritual. The police, when they came, often came quietly. They knew the men by name. Sometimes they even accepted a cut of the earnings discreetly. Of course, everyone understood their role. Shifting times then came the 1800s. Japan, after 2 centuries of isolation, opened its ports to the West. STEAMSHIPS, rifles and new ideas poured in. The shogunate crumbled. The Meiji government rose, and once again, thousands of samurai found themselves out of work. They drifted down the same roads as the gamblers and peddlers, before them bringing swords, grudges, and a certain nostalgic longing for the days when honor involved more decapitation. The Yakuza absorbed them easily. A ronin without a master was simply a koban waiting for an oyabun. By the late 1800s, the two traditions, Takia and Bokuto, had merged into something new, structured families with codes, symbols, and a growing sense of purpose. They weren't just criminals anymore. They were an institution, society's myriads. Easy to imagine the early Yakuza as villains lurking in alleys. But in truth, they were reflections of the society around them, its order, its hypocrisy, its craving for hierarchy. They enforced their own kind of justice where the state couldn't or wouldn't. They lent money to the poor, punished thieves who preyed on locals, and occasionally terrorized anyone who didn't appreciate their community service. They were protectors and parasites in equal measure, and the people of Edo knew it. They whispered complaints about the gamblers, then hired them for security at festivals. They avoided the tattooed men in the baths, then drank with them at night. Fear and respect mixed in equal parts like sake and water, inked. Shadows as we drift toward the 19th century's end. Imagine one of those early gang bosses sitting in a bathhouse, steam rising around him, his skin covered in myth. A dragon curls across his back. A goddess guards his chest. On his shoulder, waves crash eternally upward. He's not a nobleman, not a general, but he carries his own mythology etched beneath the surface. His followers wait outside, rolling dice and pretending not to listen. Tomorrow they'll collect debts, manage stalls, maybe settle a dispute with another group. The city will keep turning. The lanterns will still glow, and the soft tapping of dice will blend into the heartbeat of a nation learning, slowly, that its outlaws sometimes make the best. Administrators, let's drift onward to how those gamblers and peddlers transformed into full-fledged families, how loyalty turned to law, and how the quiet moral grey of Edo's underworld darkened into something far more organized. By the mid-19th century, the Tokugawa shogunate had decided that tattooing was unseemly. It blurred class lines, distracted workers, and scandalized foreigners, so they outlawed it then. When Japan opened to the West during the Meiji Restoration, they banned it again, this time to appear more civilized to European visitors, because nothing screams refinement like pretending you don't have a centuries-old art tradition. Tattoo artists went underground. They continued their work in hidden rooms, often disguised as barbers or acupuncturists. Their clients, laborers, firemen, and eventually criminals, kept the tradition alive, and thus the modern stigma of Irizumi was born, from outlaws to icons. When Western sailors visited Japan in the late 1800s, they were fascinated by the intricate tattoos they glimpsed in the bathhouses. Some even got them done, bringing the art form back to Europe as exotic souvenirs. Meanwhile, in Japan itself, the tattoos were slowly becoming associated with a new underclass. The Yakuza, organized crime groups, adopted Irizumi as a symbol of loyalty and toughness. The full-body suits became both initiation and identity, a sign that one had suffered for the family, that one's allegiance was quite literally skin-deep to outsiders. This turned the art into something dangerous. But within those circles, it remained what it had always been, a badge of endurance, of beauty earned through pain, ink and identity. Even today, tattoos in Japan carry a quiet tension. Walk into a public pool or hot spring, and you might see signs politely forbidding entry to anyone with visible ink. It's not personal, it's cultural memory, a hangover from centuries when tattoos meant crime, defiance, or both. Yet, beneath that stigma, the tradition survives. In studios where Master Harishi still work by hand, their needles tapping softly through the hum of incense, their clients still sit in silence for hours, enduring the same pain their ancestors did, for the same reason, because beauty that costs nothing means nothing. And if you ask the artists why they continue, they'll usually smile faintly and say something vague, like, the body is temporary, the story is not, which sounds philosophical and also conveniently evasive. A slow fade of color. The colors of traditional Irizumi are specific, deep indigo blues, reds that fade to rose, greens with hints of gray. The pigments themselves were once natural, ground minerals, plant dyes, soot. The inks were thick, almost smoky. They aged like wood, slowly dulling but never disappearing. Under the skin, They became part of the person, as if the body had quietly decided to keep a secret in plain sight. Modern machines make the process faster, cleaner, and arguably safer. But the hand-poked rhythm of traditional Immersive still has a heartbeat of its own, a slow percussion that echoes through centuries. Tap, tap, breath ink. A rhythm as steady as sleep, drifting out of the Edo night so as the candlelight of Edo flickers out. Imagine one of those tattooed laborers, walking home through the narrow streets. The scent of sake and charcoal still lingers in the air. The paper lanterns sway gently above. He's tired. His back's still sore from the day's work, and from the ink session he endured the night before. Underneath his worn cotton robe, dragons coil across his skin, unseen by anyone around him. Tomorrow, he'll lift barrels or pull carts or haul lumber, and no one will notice the myth sleeping beneath his sweat. But he knows, and the artist who inked him knows, and the gods, somewhere above all this, probably appreciate the effort. Let's drift, then, to the next layer of this story, deeper into the symbolism, the craft, and the quiet endurance that made Irezumi what it is, because beneath every line of ink lies something much older, the need to be seen, even in a world that prefers you hidden. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to the smoky wooden streets of Edo Old Tokyo, where the paper lanterns burned low, and honor was something you could lose faster than your sandals. If you're cozy, good. If not, take a moment. Adjust your pillow. Let the day fade, because tonight we're tracing the quiet, unhurried birth of Japan's most enduring underworld, the Yakuza. The men with the tattoos, the codes, and the oddly consistent sense of punctuality. But before the modern suits, before the movies, before the whispered word mafia ever crossed an ocean, there were gamblers, drifters, and outcasts. People who lived on the edges of a society that prized order above all things, and, naturally, when you push enough people to the edges, they start organizing there, a country at peace. And board the Yakuza's roots begin not in chaos but in peace, which feels like a contradiction, but stay with me. In the early 1600s, Japan finally unified under the Tokugawa shogunate. After centuries of civil war, castle sieges, and samurai politely decapitating one another for reasons that now sound vague at best, the fighting stopped. The samurai, once professional warriors, suddenly had nothing to do. It was a bit like retiring the entire military overnight and telling them to take up flower arranging. So the shogunate did what any government does when it's terrified of the people it just disarmed. It invented paperwork, ranks, registries, regulations. The Tokugawa turned Japan into an administrative masterpiece. Every class had its rules, every town its curfews. Even hairstyles were categorized. It was peaceful, stable, boring, and boredom, as history repeatedly proves, breeds mischief. The floating world while the upper classes sipped tea and debated poetry. The working people of Edo created their own form of culture, something the elites preferred to call ukiyo. The floating world, it was a world of kabuki theaters, sake houses, and gambling dens tucked behind respectable shops. A place where you could forget your station, your debts, and occasionally, your wife. This was the soil from which the Yakuza grew fertile, humid, and just disreputable enough. And it's here we meet two key ancestors, the takiya and the bukuto. The takiya, the traveling peddlers. The takiya were depending on whom you asked, con artists with tents. They sold charms, cloth, medicines of questionable composition, and occasionally nothing at all. Their stalls popped up at temple fairs and festivals, blending into the carnival hum of Edo's streets. Japan's class system placed merchants near the bottom, just above entertainers and slightly below useful dirt. So the takiya made their own order. They organized into groups, led by bosses called oyabin, literally parent figures. Their followers were kobon, child figures. The oyabankabon became the blueprint of Yakuza loyalty, a family not by blood, but by choice and obligation. If the oyaban fed you, you owed him service. If he protected you, you protected his reputation. And if you betrayed him, well, you'd better enjoy life with 9 fingers. Market morality despite their shady reputation. Takiya groups served an odd social function. They managed markets, settled disputes, and enforced a kind of unwritten justice. If 2 stall owners fought, the oyaban stepped in. If a drunk samurai bullied a merchant, the takiya quietly handled it with persuasion, or occasionally with a broom handle. By the 1700s, they'd even earned grudging recognition. The shogunate licensed certain takiya groups to supervise festivals, effectively turning outlaws into subcontracted civil servants. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of saying, "We can't stop you, so we might as well hire you." The bakuto, gambling menden. There were the bakuto, the gamblers. Their world was smaller, smokier, and filled with the comforting sound of dice rattling in bamboo cups. The game of choice was chohan, a simple wager on whether the dice would land on even or odd. If that sounds straightforward, remember, this is human history. It never stays that way for long. Soon there were side bets, scams, and elaborate rituals. The gamblers developed a culture, tattoo slang, and a hierarchy as rigid as any samurai clan. Like the bokuto were outsiders, men who lived from game to game, traveling from one rural inn to another. They attracted thieves, wanderers, and people who'd misplaced their social standing somewhere along the road. They also attracted punishment. Gambling was officially illegal, which made it, of course, extremely popular. When caught, gamblers could be flogged, tattooed with marks of shame, or banished. But for many, that was a small price for a chance at quick money and quicker respect. Numbers and names. The word Yakuza itself comes from a losing hand in a card game. Yakuza 8, 9, 3, a total of 20, which in the game of Oichikabu meant nothing, 0, worthless. So Yakuza literally means the good for nothings. A humble start for what would become Japan's most infamous institution. The term stuck because, frankly, they liked it. There's something endearingly honest about naming your group after failure, tattoo's sake. And sincerity. The bokuto also gave the Yakuza 2 of their most enduring traditions. Full-body tattoos and ritual sake sharing. Tattooing in Edo, Japan was both punishment and pride. Criminals were marked for shame, but gamblers adopted the practice as defiance, transforming the stigma into art. They covered their criminal marks with magnificent designs, dragons, koi, gods of fortune. What began as a scar became a story. Asterisk. So, even if affection came later, the institution itself held immense weight. It wasn't about 2 people falling in love. It was about 2 families deciding to survive. The sound of a Norse wedding, you could hear it now. It would sound like laughter through mead hall smoke. The crack of firewood, the clatter of cups, A few drunken boasts that someone would regret in the morning outside. The wind would scrape against the timber walls, carrying the sea's cold breath. Inside, the couple would sit side by side, the newly bound husband and wife, not necessarily smiling, but calm, steady. The hall would flicker with torchlight, and the guests would sing old songs that made no sense to anyone under 900 years old, and somewhere in the rafters, the gods, or maybe just the mice, would listen in, drifting forward. So that's how love, or something resembling it, worked in the Norse world. It was practical, loud, inebriated, and for all its strangeness, it wasn't so different from ours. The search for belonging, the rituals, the hope that this person across from you at the firelight might not ruin your life. Let's drift, then, to the next part of our story, to what came after the vows, because marriage in the Viking world didn't end at the feast. It was only just beginning. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back across oceans to a land of cedar forests, paper lanterns, and a culture that managed to make even body art a matter of honor. Discipline and mild existential crisis. Settle in. Dim the lights. Let your thoughts slow down like falling ink in water dot, because tonight, we're exploring the art of irizumi, the traditional Japanese tattoo, and the centuries of beauty, shame, and stubborn artistry behind it. The first marks our story begins far before neon signs, samurai epics, or the Yakuza. Thousands of years ago, long before Japan was Japan, the people who lived across its islands already knew the needle. Archaeologists have found clay figures from the Jomon period, roughly Yuan BCV, with patterns etched into their faces and arms. Spirals, lines, dots. Were they tattoos? We can't say for sure. But early Chinese chronicles those eternally judgmental outside. Observers claimed that the ancient Japanese decorated their bodies with designs, believing they protected against evil spirits and sea monsters, which, in fairness, makes more sense than sunscreen. These early markings weren't fashion statements. They were talismans, living amulets carved into skin, keeping bad luck at bay while pleasing whichever gods were paying attention that week. Over time, though, something shifted. Tattoos began to mean other things, and not all of them were flattering. Ink as punishment. By the time Japan entered its more organized eras, the Yamato and early Nara periods, tattoos were no longer spiritual. They were judicial, in other words. The government decided they'd make excellent public shaming tools. Criminals were tattooed, with simple but unmistakable marks, usually on the face or forearm, declaring their offense to the world. A thief might receive a dark stripe across his brow. A deserter might bear the symbol for dog. And because bureaucracy loves consistency, each province had its own signature pattern. So, a traveler's tattoo could quietly tell you whether he'd stolen rice in Osaka or stabbed someone in Kyushu. Imagine the awkward silences that caused at dinner. This branding system, called irizumi kai, or tattoo penalty, was the earliest structured form of tattooing in Japan. And while the marks were crude, the message was refined. You had sinned, and now everyone would know it. It was efficient social engineering. Because why imprison someone when you can turn their forehead into a lifelong warning label? The shift to art. But then, as centuries passed, Japanese tattooing did what most cultural taboos eventually do. It got interesting by the Edo period, roughly the 1600s to mid-1800s. The shogunate had stabilized Japan into a strange mix of peace and repression. People weren't killing each other as much, which left more time for creativity. The lower classes, artisans, laborers, merchants, were forbidden to display luxury. Silk was for the elite. Bright colors were restricted. Even hairstyles had regulations, so naturally, people found another way to express themselves, under their clothes, beneath plain garments. Full-body tattoos bloomed elaborate, secret tapestries of ink that only a chosen few could see. The irony, of course, was delicious. The same government that had once used tattoos to mark criminals, now indirectly inspired an underground art form. Ukiyo-e and the birth of stylets drift for a moment. Through the floating world, ukiyo, as it was called, the Edo period's urban centers were alive with kabuki theaters and brothels, all pulsing with the rhythm of forbidden pleasures. Artists of the ukiyo-e school, woodblock printmakers, captured it all. Courtesans, wrestlers, actors, demons, and heroes. And among them was a book that changed everything. Suikoden, published in the early 1800s. It was a Japanese adaptation of a Chinese novel about 108 outlaws, righteous rebels, covered in tattoos. The woodblock illustrations were stunning. Warriors with dragons coiled around their arms, tigers snarling across their chests, waves crashing down their backs. These prints didn't just inspire admiration, they created desire. Men across Edo wanted those same designs on their own skin, not as punishment, but as power. A visual claim to courage, loyalty, and defiance. Tattoo artists Harishi answered the call. Using fine needles and a steady hand, they transformed the body into a living scroll. Technique and pain traditional. Irezumi wasn't done with buzzing electric machines. It was created with a slender wooden or metal handle fitted with needles, a tool called nome or hari. The artist would dip it into ink, often made from charcoal, soot, or pigment mixed with water, and then hand-poke it into the skin, dot by dot, line by line. The process was slow, meditative, excruciating. A full-body design could take years to complete. The client would lie still for hours, muscles locked, breath shallow, while the artist tapped rhythmically. Some compared it to a trance, others to a very polite form of torture. But pain was part of the point. In a culture that valued endurance and quiet perseverance, suffering through Irezumi became a proof of strength. A private stoicism inked permanently beneath one's clothes. And despite the pain, or perhaps because of it, the results were breathtaking. Themes and motifs. Irezumi told a story. A koi fish swimming upstream symbolized perseverance, because koi, like stubborn overachievers, were believed to turn into dragons if they made it up the waterfall. A dragon itself represented power and wisdom, but also self-control, a nod to the disciplined chaos of nature. Tigers stood for courage, snakes for protection, peonies for wealth and beauty. Waves were everywhere, fluid, curling, endless, representing both lives, constant motion and Japan's uneasy friendship with the sea. But perhaps the most striking element wasn't the imagery, it was the composition. Irezumi wasn't scattered decoration. It was designed as a single flowing masterpiece, back pieces merged into sleeves, chest panels curved with the body's movement, legs and shoulders mirrored natural rhythm. The body wasn't a canvas, it was a collaborator. And when a man stripped down to bathe, as people often did in Edo's public bathhouses. The sight of a full suit of tattoos was both shocking and mesmerizing. It wasn't rebellion, exactly. But it was definitely not obedience either. The hidden and the revealed in a society obsessed with modesty and class order. Tattooing created a secret dual identity. On the surface, a man might appear humble, a carpenter, a porter, a rickshaw driver, plain kimono, polite bow, but underneath, his skin told a different story. Gods and beasts, heroes and ghosts, woven together in silent defiance. The tattoos were usually hidden during work, revealed only in bathhouses or among trusted company, and yet everyone knew who had them. It became a subculture of pride, not criminality, at least not yet, but belonging. These were men of labor, people who built the city, hauled its goods, and lived without titles or land. Their art was their nobility. Of course, the actual nobility disapproved, which only made it more appealing. The government steps in again naturally. When the ruling class sees too many commoners enjoying something, they feel compelled to ban it. Asterisk. As for you, one of his forgotten concubines, your life would quietly dissolve into history's background noise. You might have been freed, or remarried, or simply faded into the anonymous crowd. No monuments, no marble busts, just the faint memory of what it was like to live inside the empire's strangest. Dream, one man's desperate performance in a city too old to care, drifting out of the empire as the candlelight dims and the marble fades. Let's leave Nero's Rome behind. The fire's embers have cooled. The lyre has fallen silent, and in the stillness of the ancient city, you can almost hear the ghosts of ambition, soft, self-absorbed, and utterly human, because in the end, Nero wasn't the last of his kind. He was simply the loudest asterisk. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a colder time, to the lands of fjords. Longhouses and people who thought that the best way to celebrate love was with beer, bargain agreements, and a solid chance of frostbite. So, get comfortable. Pull up your blankets. Maybe imagine a low fire crackling somewhere nearby, the kind that makes the walls glow and the shadows stretch. Because tonight, we're going to explore the gentle, awkward, and occasionally axe-related world of Norse marriage and wedding rituals. Setting the scene, the Viking Age, roughly between the 8th and the 11th centuries, was not famous for romance. These were people who carved dragons on their ships, burned down monasteries, and measured personal worth in silver and goats. But for all their violence and oceanic enthusiasm, the Norse took marriage very seriously. It wasn't just about affection, though. Occasionally, there might be some. It was about property, honor, family, alliances, and making sure your children were legitimate enough not to cause blood feuds later. Marriage, in that world, was both a legal arrangement and a mild social panic. And if you were a Norseman or Norsewoman preparing for marriage, there was a whole icy mountain of ritual standing between you and your happily ever after. Love was optional. Let's start with expectations in Norse society. Love wasn't the point of marriage. It was a nice bonus, like having a roof that didn't leak. Marriages were arranged between families, sometimes when the bride and groom were still children, sometimes after a bit of social negotiation that sounded suspiciously like haggling over livestock. A father or male guardian handled the talks, often with a trusted go-between called a matchmaker. Though transaction broker might be more accurate, the goal was mutual benefit, land for land, wealth for wealth, reputation for reputation. A good marriage could cement peace between rival families. A bad one could start wars, so no pressure. Negotiations and the bride price set. The first stage was the negotiation, the munda or bride-price. Now, this wasn't payment for the bride, exactly. It was more like a security deposit to show the groom's family could afford her, and that if things went badly, there'd be some financial cushion for everyone's embarrassment. The munda was usually paid in silver, livestock, or property. Sometimes swords, because nothing says commitment like giving your future Delanor a high-quality murder tool. After that came the airfilger, or dowry, the property the bride brought into the marriage. That included her clothing, jewelry, possibly a few household slaves, and sometimes a small farm. All of this was carefully recorded, with witnesses present, because nothing ruins a wedding faster than a later argument over who owns the goat. The bride and groom's preparations in modern weddings. We talk about getting ready, hair, makeup, nerves. In the Viking world, preparation meant purification. The bride would be taken to a bathhouse, a log where she'd wash herself in warm water scented with herbs, attended by female relatives. It wasn't exactly a spa day, but close enough by 10th century standards. The groom had his own ritual, and it was significantly bloodier. He'd symbolically shed his boyhood by sacrificing a weapon or even an animal to the gods, usually Thor or Freya, depending on local preference. In some regions, he might spend a night meditating or fasting, though fasting in Viking culture usually meant drinking less beer than usual. Then came the sword ceremony. The groom would present the bride with a sword that had belonged to one of his ancestors, a symbol that she was now part of his family line. She, in turn, would offer him a new sword, representing their future descendants. You can think of it as exchanging rings. If rings could decapitate someone, the feast, because of course no Viking ritual was complete without a feast. The wedding feast could last for days, sometimes a full week if the families were wealthy or trying to outdo each other. There'd be roasted meats, barrels of ale and mead, and endless toasts to gods, ancestors, and occasionally to people who hadn't died yet but probably would soon. The guests would eat, sing, boast, and make bawdy jokes about fertility, because nothing sets the mood for romance quite like your uncle loudly discussing Freya's famous fertility statue. The bride and groom would sit together on the high seat, the place of honor, flanked by candles and sometimes small carved idols of the gods. It was both festive and deeply symbolic, the joining of two families under divine witness, lit by fire and fermented courage. The bed ceremony. Now, this is where things get slightly awkward at the end of the feast. The newlyweds would be led to their marital bed, often a ceremonial one prepared in advance. Guests would follow them into the room, carrying torches, singing songs, and loudly wishing them fertility. Privacy was not a Viking virtue in some accounts. Witnesses actually stayed until the couple lay down together, because nothing says intimacy like your great-aunt clapping from the doorway. Once the ritual part was complete, the room would finally empty, and the newlyweds were left alone. If they were lucky, they liked each other. If not, well, the Norse didn't really have a word for awkward silence, but they definitely experienced it. Morning after the next morning, the household would gather for breakfast, a polite way of confirming that the marriage had been consummated and that everything was now official. The bride would receive gifts often, jewelry or household goods, from her new husband and sometimes from his family. These were called morginjifu, or mourning gifts. It was a gesture meant to symbolize respect and status, though probably also an apology for the previous night's audience. After that, the woman's position in society changed dramatically. She was now a Husfrasier, mistress of the household, responsible for managing servants, stores, and family honor despite modern assumptions. Norse women held considerable power within marriage. They could inherit property, manage farms in their husband's absence, and even divorce their husbands if mistreated, though mistreatment had a fairly high bar, considering this was a culture where people routinely settled disputes with axes, gods, and blessings. Religion was woven into every thread of Viking marriage. The god most often associated with weddings was Freyja, the deity of fertility, prosperity, and mildly suggestive statues. His twin sister, Freyja, was also invoked, being the goddess of love, beauty, and occasionally war, depending on her mood. Offerings were made at the family shrine, a hergar, or at the community temple. Goats or pigs were the usual sacrifices. Though some regions preferred horses, the blood of the sacrificed animal would be sprinkled, yes, sprinkled on the couple, the guests, and the house pillars. It was called bled, and it symbolized blessing, fertility, and, well, the need for laundry afterward. Priests, or goga, presided over the rituals, but everyone participated. In Viking society, faith wasn't something you watched. It was something you splashed yourself with. Superstitions and omens. No good wedding came without its share of superstitions. It was bad luck if the bride stumbled while walking to the ceremony. It meant the gods were displeased, or that her new husband would be clumsy in bed. Interpretations varied. If a raven appeared during the feast, it was a sign of Odin's approval, or of an impending battle, again open to interpretation. The bride's veil, called the Arlen, was considered sacred, meant to protect her from evil spirits and from any wandering attention of the local elves, who, in Norse imagination, were nosy and uninvited. After Christianity crept into Scandinavia, these older customs didn't disappear. They just blended in. The priest replaced the gogi, the church replaced the hall, and the mead feast remained blissfully unchanged, because even new gods couldn't get between a Norseman and his alcohol. Divorce. Viking style, yes, they had it. Unlike many medieval cultures, divorce in Norse society was surprisingly practical. If a husband mistreated his wife, failed to support her, or made her life generally unpleasant, she could announce the end of the marriage in front of witnesses. The legal phrase was short and sweet, something along the lines of, "I divorce you, as witness these men." Property would then be divided according to the original agreements, and both parties could remarry. There were even cases of women divorcing their husbands for wearing unmanly clothing. So apparently, Viking fashion policing was alive and well. Why marriage mattered. Marriage wasn't just a family affair. It was the backbone of Norse society. It defined social status, property rights, and inheritance. It tied clans together, ended feuds, and determined who could call themselves legitimate. Children born outside of marriage weren't necessarily shunned. This was, after all, a society of raiders and travelers, but they did face certain legal disadvantages. Asterisk. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a time when the Roman Empire was young, ambitious, and already spectacularly dysfunctional. So, get comfortable. Dim the lights. Let the world quiet down for a while, and imagine yourself living in the marble shadow of Emperor Nero, not as a senator or a general, or even one of those poor poets forced to read their work to him while he stared blankly into space. No, you are something slightly less voluntary. You are a concubine in the imperial palace, which is really just a delicate way of saying you're part of the emperor's personal entertainment department. And unfortunately for you, your emperor is Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, a man who was, by all contemporary accounts, somewhere between a theatre kid and an arsonist. The palace and the problem, the first thing you'd notice, drifting through Nero's golden halls, is the smell. Not incense or roses. No, Rome smells mostly of smoke, sweat, and too many people. The palace itself, the Domos Aurea, or Golden House, was Nero's attempt to outshine every other ruler by building something so absurdly grand that it made even the gods look underdressed. Marble walls, gilded ceilings, fountains that ran with wine, which sounds nice until you realize wine fountains go sour after a day. It was like Nero himself, a project born from insecurity and excess, and you, as one of his concubines, would live inside this gilded aquarium, every corner gleaming, every shadow whispering with gossip. You wouldn't really belong to Nero. No one did, but you'd orbit him like a pale moon around a dying star. You'd be fed luxuries you didn't ask for, adorned in jewelry you couldn't pawn, and watched by servants who reported everything your name, if you were lucky, might appear in one of those private palace ledgers. If not, you'd just be one of Nero's girls, an entryless name. A whisper meeting the emperor meeting Nero was unpredictable. Sometimes he'd appear like a vision, perfumed, draped in silk, claiming divine inspiration for his next performance. Sometimes he'd stumble in from an all-night feast, humming off-key, covered in spilled wine and ideas about artistic immortality. If he was in a good mood, he'd want to perform for you. You'd sit there, trying to look enchanted while he strummed his lyre poorly and sang about how the gods envied his voice. It was safer to agree if he was in a bad mood. You'd learn why so many of his guests mysteriously fell ill after dinner. The real danger with Nero wasn't violence, though he was capable of it, but boredom. Nero, you see, had the attention span of a spoiled deity and the emotional stability of a theatre critic. He was perpetually searching for novelty, a new sound, a new dish, a new affection, and when novelty fades, so does mercy. Rome's first teenage emperor lets drift back a little. Nero became emperor at 17, which, if you've ever met a 17-year-old, explains a lot. His mother, Agrippina the younger, made sure of his success. She had maneuvered, manipulated, and allegedly murdered her way to placing her son on the throne. Agrippina was the kind of mother who sent congratulatory fruit baskets to assassins. At first, she was the true ruler. Nero was her handsome puppet, the emperor in name only. He smiled, recited speeches she wrote, and waved to the Senate like a trained dolphin. But as Nero got older, he began to resent her. She reminded him too much of what he owed her, and Nero preferred debts only in the financial sense, where he could ignore them, eventually. He decided to have her killed. Naturally, the first attempt was creative. He designed a collapsible boat that would fall apart at sea and drown her. Unfortunately, Agrippina was a strong swimmer, an awkward oversight. She survived, crawled back to shore, and returned home furious. So Nero switched tactics. He simply sent soldiers to finish the job. When told his mother had been successfully murdered, Nero reportedly celebrated by running barefoot through the palace. That was the sort of household you'd now be living in. Life inside the golden cage as a concubine. Your world would revolve around timing. You'd learn when to laugh softly, when to disappear, when to feign interest in Nero's poems about himself. You'd perfect the art of nodding meaningfully at things that made no sense. In return, you'd receive gowns from the East, pearls from Egypt, and possibly a mild stomach illness from whatever was in the palace wine. Nero's parties were famous and exhausting. He'd host banquets that lasted from sunset until well past dawn. Tables groaned under roasted peacocks, flamingo tongues, and desserts shaped like mythological tragedies. He'd invite hundreds of guests, and yet somehow everything was still about him. At some point, the emperor would take the stage, because of course he would, wearing something flowy, dramatic, and slightly see-through. He'd sing about Troy, about the gods, about himself as the new Apollo. The audience would applaud loudly, because the penalty for not applauding was death. You, sitting among the other concubines, would clap until your hands stung at the fire. It's impossible to talk about Nero without mentioning the fire in 64 CE. Rome burned for days. Entire districts vanished in flame. Thousands were left homeless. The city's skyline was reduced to smoke and embers. Nero's response was mixed. Some say he played the lyre and sang as the city burned, enjoying the acoustics. Others claim he was away when it started and returned to help. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere between convenient and catastrophic. He certainly used the disaster to his advantage. With much of Rome destroyed, Nero had the perfect excuse to rebuild it in his image. He seized land, cleared rubble, and began constructing his golden house. It had banquet halls with revolving ceilings, frescoes of himself as a god, and an artificial lake in the center. When it was complete, Nero looked upon it and said, "Now at last I can live like a human being." You, however, might have thought otherwise, because living in Nero's palace meant living in a place that reflected only one man's dreams and everyone else's quiet dread. The women of Nero's life to survive Nero's attention was a skill. To lose it could be fatal. He married 3 times, though married might be a generous word for what those arrangements were. His first wife, Octavia, was the daughter of Emperor Claudius, calm, polite, and utterly uninterested in Nero's performances. So he divorced her, accused her of adultery, and had her executed. His second wife, Papaya Sabina, was more ambitious. She encouraged his cruelty and knew exactly how to flatter him. She became empress, then pregnant. But during one of Nero's infamous rages, he struck her and she died. His grief, predictably, was dramatic and self-serving. He ordered her body embalmed in spices and displayed her statue in the palace. Later, he had a young boy named Sporus, castrated and dressed like Papaya, because Nero missed her and wanted a look-alike as a concubine. You'd watch all this quietly. You'd learn that affection in the imperial palace was a kind of weather, unpredictable, dangerous, and entirely beyond your control. The artist's Emperor Nero liked to think of himself as an artist, which is an issue when your hobbies include having people executed for yawning during your recitals. He competed in Greek festivals as a singer, a charioteer, even an actor. Naturally, he always won. No one wanted to explain to the emperor that his singing sounded like a cat trapped under marble. He returned from Greece laden with trophies, smiling like a man convinced of his own greatness. Rome pretended to share his enthusiasm, while quietly calculating how long this could go on. You might have stood beside him during one of these celebrations, smiling through exhaustion while he proclaimed that art, not politics, was the true soul of Rome. It sounded lovely, and it meant absolutely nothing. Whispered fear life in the palace was a performance of its own. Every servant watched their words. Every senator smiled too widely. Every musician pretended Nero's compositions were divine. In the gardens, whispers traveled faster than the fountain's murmur. One day you might hear that the Praetorian Guard was growing restless. The next, that the Senate was secretly plotting, and in the evenings, Nero would pace the corridors, muttering about conspiracies and betrayal. He had friends executed, advisors exiled, and poets flogged for writing metaphors that might apply to him. You'd learn not to speak at all. Silence was survival. The decline by the time Nero reached his late 20s, the empire had begun to unravel. Provinces rebelled, generals refused orders, and even Rome itself grew weary of his performances. He spent money faster than the empire could mint coins. The treasury emptied, taxes rose. The people who once cheered him began to mutter. When rebellion finally came, it came quietly, like the closing act of a very long, tragic play. The Senate declared him an enemy of the state. The Praetorian Guard deserted him. He fled the city in disguise, hiding in a villa outside Rome. They're abandoned by almost everyone. Nero asked his few remaining servants to dig him a grave. When soldiers approached, he took his own life. His last words were, reportedly, "What an artist dies in me," a line so perfectly self-absorbed that it almost feels rehearsed. After Nero, when word of his death spread, Rome reacted with a mix of relief and disbelief. Some refused to believe he was gone. Others celebrated in the streets. The palace, his golden dream, became a ruin. The next emperors filled in his artificial lake and built public baths over it. Rome, in its practical way, recycled even its tyrants. Asterisk,